Now, what you'll see in this lesson is the reason I launched this entire video series in the first place. I wanted to explain the strategic perspective on the current world scene because the media doesn't help. And even from some good news sources out there like some economic blogs, we just get rapid fire noise about markets and they sort of chalk everything up to corruption and government incompetence, but the truth is actually much more sophisticated. We're undergoing a massive strategic global transition. A few in the alternative media describe it using a bunch of emotion and hype, which is fine and works for a lot of people. But I wanted to do it in a way that would communicate to a different type of audience and attract people who think analytically and would prefer to avoid theatrics. And the first thing to remember is that we're all stuck in a system that must continually grow just based on the math of the bond market. It's pushed beyond towns, counties, and states and has been pushing against nations for a long time to the point where it's now trying to establish a single integrated global system. And now I got to deal with the typical objections to this immediately because many people will be inclined to turn off the video at this point. They may call this ridiculous because they've heard versions of this New World Order presented with a bunch of theatrical hype, so of course they don't believe it. But I will just try to present the facts based on the monetary, corporate, and governance systems we're living in and interpret them through the lens of the history we saw in Lesson 1. And some say this whole thing is impossible, like the world's too big. Well, it's pretty much already happened on the economic dimension, so they're either not paying attention or they aren't thinking at the right level in terms of scale, which you hopefully remember from Lesson 4. And others say they're too much of a believer in chaos theory to accept this. But actually, chaos theory says the exact opposite. It suggests that what we may perceive as random chaos is actually a very intricate, even predictable pattern of ripple effects stemming from a central cause or tweak to the system. And I'd suggest that's exactly what's happening in the world. The corporate media portrays nothing but the random chaos on the nightly news. But in point of fact, we are hearing the intricately patterned ripple effects of a system dominated by a few who use leverage to make powerful changes. And I'll try to illustrate the intricate pattern in this lesson. Finally, others say this is conspiracy theory. Nope, it's math. And math that requires exponential debt growth and creates incredible leverage. This is the basic math of the bond market that has transcended nation states. And to call it conspiracy is to highlight the fact that we are not taught the truth about the world's financial system. The leverage created by that system has been used to standardize governments, collapse economies, establish dollar hegemony, secure ownership rights over natural resources, and basically increase the pyramid of the Anglo banking and corporate system. Mega levels of debt is used to pull off corporate takeovers of governments, just like debt was used in the 80s to pull off corporate takeovers of companies. In other words, leverage is used to bring other countries that might be republics or another form of government into the top-down financial empire system. And it typically does this through supposed financial crises. This is how the Anglo-American empire grows externally. It's grown a lot internally by increasing the scale and velocity of the system, but it grows externally by economically conquering countries, which is way more effective than using the military. We've seen this in a multitude of countries in the past. Each of these was reported in the media as a crisis caused by governments that was fixed by the supposedly responsible financiers. Will we ever learn? How many times will the same story be repeated before people bother to notice the common pattern? The truth is that these countries were attacked by the financiers in the first place, and typically the governments had no idea what was happening to them, or they were bought off. And what was almost never reported was how the structure of each of these countries has changed as a result of the crisis. How its resources were handed over to corporate institutions. How the country was put into even more debt from the IMF and commercial banks like JP Morgan Chase, and all the other aspects of restructuring that occurred coming out of these crises. The same thing is going to happen in other countries. We'll see it in these European countries. We'll see it eventually in the bigger developed countries of Europe. And we'll see it in the United States. And this will bring the rest of the world into a depression, which will be used in the same way the Great Depression of the 20th century was used, as we saw in Lesson 1, to force nations to submit to a new debt-based system. And before we get into the details of that system, we need to understand the strategic economic picture of the world today. How does this big American pyramid we've been discussing fit into the strategic perspective? Well, first, it's tied to Britain via the Bank of England and the British Empire system. This is why I've called it the Anglo-American Empire. It's really a joint venture. And it lords over most of the Western Hemisphere. The smaller pyramids of Canada and Mexico are tied to it, and most of South America is managed by it. South America really isn't its own pyramid, but is rather a satellite system. And South and Central America are largely tied to the dollar, run by the CIA and the State Department, and our banks and corporations. Of course, Venezuela is a big exception, and Brazil is a production powerhouse that could break away and be its own pyramid if it got creative. But to understand the strategic perspective, it's useful to view the entire hemisphere as at least being heavily influenced by the Anglo-American Empire. Then across the Atlantic is the rest of Europe. Germany and the smaller European countries are their own productive pyramids, but they're controlled by the Anglo-American financial system. And Africa and much of the Middle East are satellites. The British Empire has maintained control by fueling chaos in Africa for centuries, and they have powerful influence over the Middle East, since the Arabian royal system is an extension of the British royal system. And where the royal system doesn't have control, that's where you see the American military moving in. Then the third primary economic system of the world is in Asia, mainly Japan and China. Like Britain, Japan is a financial empire run by a royal family, and China is a mega production powerhouse that will dominate the 21st century. And the rest of Asia is largely controlled by these powers and the Anglo-American financial system. And these regions are tied together by, guess what? It's the bond market, represented here by the dotted lines, and they're also tied by the global central banking network and the international institutions like the IMF and the BIS. And then the G20 is the group of economists and politicians from the primary developed countries who are making this globalization happen. So this picture of the world today is the trilateral chessboard. And I use that name deliberately. It's the work of the Trilateral Commission and the other planning bodies of the global empire. And they view the world as a chessboard. Key Trilateral Commission member Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, which made this quite clear. And he now runs the strategic policy of the Obama administration. Now, one critical piece of the chessboard is not in this diagram yet. Russia. Yeltsin was going along with the American plan, the Anglo-American plan, but Putin has thrown a wrench in it. He's a nationalist that would rather not be conquered by the central banks, commercial banks like JP Morgan Chase, and industrial oligarchs, many of whom he put in prison. But it's not clear if he's being used by higher powers as a key attack piece on the chessboard, or if he's truly independent. The global strategists rely on dialectical conflict to shape the world, so Russia could very well be a useful dialectical chess piece. I tend to doubt it because the CIA is very worried about Putin, but we'll see in the near future. And Russia has power with other anti-corporate states like Iran and Venezuela. So this is the key wild card. Will this power bloc be able to leverage relationships with, say, China to checkmate the Anglo-American system? Well, I expect the global financiers will try to collapse nations to control the outcome here by using the same tactic we saw in Lesson 1 to create the American financial empire. A major global depression is on the way, as I mentioned a couple slides back, as the U.S. goes into a financial crisis. This will cripple the nations like the Great Depression crippled the states. And along with depressions come global wars. So we will see World War III launched by the Anglo-American Empire against Iran and the powers that come to its aid. The world's population and most nations will be demoralized and fairly powerless to solve the problem, which will allow for a new potential pyramid to be created just like we saw in Lesson 1. A new global currency, which will be debt-based, of course, will be introduced in order to crank up a new global debt machine. And before that machine can launch, a new global tax engine needs to be created. We've seen glimpses of that in the press that propose banking tax, internet tax, carbon tax, and transaction tax, all sorts of taxes which would be used to fuel a new global government. But it's not really been created yet. And my guess is that it won't be accepted by much of the world until they experience some of this pain from Depression 2.0 and World War III. But once it's established, the machine will be ready to crank up the 21st century with a new elite banking layer, which will, by the way, be largely centered in Asia. The largest banks are now in China. Asian financial institutions have a massive amount of the world's assets at this point, while the Western nations and institutions have an equally massive amount of debt. The G2 relationship plays a critical role here. It's the bankers' way of tying the US and China together, so they will have control over both governments. And that's certainly worked with the US government. It's pretty much run by the bankers exclusively. But we'll see if China continues to play their game. Regardless, it's no accident that China seems to be the country most typically associated in the press with a new world economic order.